Hi, everyone. Looks like we have a couple of people still connecting to the audio right now, so we're just going to take a moment and welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. So welcome to the 6th webinar in our webinar and workshop series on better vaccine conversations. At home, at work, and in virtual meeting spaces like this one, Alaskans are tackling challenging conversations about the COVID-19 vaccine. And whether we're figuring out how to come back to the office or navigating childcare or planning family gatherings, talking about vaccination provokes powerful feelings about our safety, our health, our freedom, our autonomy, and our responsibility to the communities that we care for. So it's really easy for conversations like these to become heated quickly. Faulty assumptions and loaded words can push our relationships into vicious cycles of defensiveness, mistrust, and hostility. And that's exactly what we're going to be exploring today in more detail, is how to tackle these difficult conversations and maintain a positive stance so that we can listen deeply to the people that we're in relationship with. When these conversations go wrong, it tears at the social fabric of our community, and it doesn't make us safer or healthier. So how can we do better? Today, we're going to be focusing on compassionate listening for vaccine conversations. And just to set your expectations appropriately, this webinar is focused on exploring the theory behind listening well. And the truth is that listening skills are easier to talk about than to practice. And so we have a lot of workshops at the forum that have sections of them devoted to listening, and we're in the process of developing a workshop that's specifically 100% about listening skills. But at this point in our webinar series, the remaining series is all webinar based. We don't have any more scheduled workshops. If you are interested in pulling a group together for a specific workshop, we'd be happy to discuss putting one together for your group and doing some hands-on practice. But at this point, all of the more hands-on workshops have already taken place. And so we would need to work together to schedule one if you're interested in that. We're going to have some time for a Q&A, and we'll make sure to send out both the slides and the recording to everyone, as well as information about how to sign up for the future webinars and who to reach out to if you're interested in doing something a little bit more custom. So with that, the agenda for today is we're going to have a brief introduction to this work. Then we'll talk about barriers for listening. We'll talk about how we listen well to others. We'll talk about listening to ourselves. And then we'll talk about the upcoming webinars before moving into some space for questions and answers. So the Alaska Humanities Forum developed this series in partnership with the Alaska Children's Trust, with funding from the United Way and the municipality of Anchorage's health department. Quick caveat, the opinions, findings, and recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the Alaska Humanities Forum. They do not necessarily reflect the views of the United Way of Anchorage or the municipality of Anchorage's health department. Some of you may already be familiar with our work, and for those of you who aren't, we want to share just a short video to give you a little bit of context for who we are and how we think about the work of strengthening communities.
The world is so fast-paced now that there's not a lot of space to just sit and actually listen.
The problems that we face aren't simple. They're layered, they're nuanced.
We get into silos of people who think like us.
And that's what we often ignore. We try to solve problems in a technical way, We try to work around humans and tackle really complex issues. But at the heart of the issue and at the heart of the solution is people. One of the ways that we can build community is through stories. And at the Humanities Forum, what we do with those stories is we use them as our tool. The tool to connect people, a tool to bridge differences. If you really want to strengthen communities, you have to tackle relationships. We play the role of convening, creating that space.
A place where people and ideas could come together.
To talk about and work on the issues that are most important in our community.
Conversations that are actually thought-provoking and that matter.
Imagine if we could work through those things.
The value is bringing such diversity together.
To share values or views of the world.
If you step away from what you think you're supposed to say in a conversation,
you just can't help but have your ideas be influenced and informed by other people's ideas.
open up your mind, and that's how you really connect with people.
It opens us up to be interested in why people are the way they are.
Shared experiences create relationships, and those relationships are what solutions are built on.
And relationships aren't something short-term.
You cannot make community in a single quarter of a single year.
Our work is all about the long game.
I think that's really what's going to change our communities.
It sounds soft, but it's not.
It changes the path to what's possible.
It's the work that can actually change societies.
You start to think about future generations and what their experience is going to be.
We have the opportunity now to change history. We do, and I think we're going to do it.
Then let's have a conversation. What do we want to build?
My name is Megan Cassiola, and I'm the VP of Programs at the Forum. And I'm here with my colleague, Odd Plez, our workshop coordinator, who will be managing the Q&A once we get to that point. And so to also remind us that Odd and I are facilitating from Jayetnu, Anchorage, which is the current and the ancestral homelands of the Nanaina people. We're at the train station here right by Ship Creek, which is the location where there have been fish camps for thousands of years. And this is a sculpture by Joel Isaac, a local Dena'ina sculptor that is right near our offices and is a nice tribute to those many generations of people at fish camp. So we have 3 goals for today's webinar. We're going to start by understanding the barriers to compassionate listening. Why is it so hard? Why is it so difficult to be a compassionate listener when we're having conversations about vaccines? Then we'll talk about the specific skills for listening compassionately to someone else. And we'll close it off with just a brief piece about listening critically to yourself, because listening is not just about listening to the other person, it's also about listening to ourselves. There are 5 major barriers that I've identified for the purposes of this workshop to compassionate listening. Those are our fight, flight, freeze response, our processing speed, our assumptions, our expectations, and our goals. And we'll go through each of these. So we'll start with our fight, flight, freeze response. So we talk a little bit more about this in the very first webinar that we offered, which we have the series available on YouTube if you want to check out the previous ones. But just to give you a really brief overview of this particular idea, our lower brain, our amygdala in particular, is unable to parse the difference between a threatening bear and a threatening belief. We see these threats to ourselves physiologically in a similar way. And so we respond with the same limited set of responses. And that's our fight, flight, and freeze response. Looks a little bit different in conversation than it does when confronted by a bear. Fight usually means that we get into a very heated argument. Fleeing means we just stop participating in the conversation and we get out of the situation. And freeze might be that we don't share ourselves. We don't actually participate in the conversation actively. And we might be present physically, but we're not really present intellectually. We're not listening to what the person says when we freeze. And so one of the big barriers is that when people disagree with us about vaccines, we often feel a real palpable sense of threat that makes it difficult for us to listen. It shuts down our higher thinking, higher order thinking processes. So the second barrier to listening well is our processing speed. And I love the framing by Kate Murphy, who wrote the book, You're Not Listening. And she refers to it as that we talk like a tortoise and we think like a hare. So our talking happens at a much slower rate than our thinking does. And so the estimates, and they are estimates, is that when we talk, we say about 125 words per minute. But when we're thinking, we're processing at least 400 words per minute. Not everyone thinks in words, and so this is a very sort of open-ended metaphor, but the reality is that we are much, much faster at thinking than we are at talking. And this is what we call the speech-thought differential. The result is that when we're listening to somebody talk, we have a lot of extra room for a lot of extra thought. And that's where our mind gets distracted and we go off on tangents and we stop listening altogether because we have this extra space. We start going down a pathway in our thoughts and we lose track of the conversation. So that speech-thought differential gives us space to think beyond the conversation, which can be a good thing, but it can also allow us to get really easily distracted by our own thoughts. The third barrier to compassionate listening is our assumptions. And so again, same woman has a quote, while you might think you're more likely to listen to a loved one than a stranger, in fact, the opposite is true. And the reason is that oftentimes, because we're closer to a person that we love, whether that's a spouse or a significant other or a friend or a family member, we also have a tendency to assume that we already know a lot about them. And it shuts down our curiosity and we stop listening to them as well as somebody that we don't know all of these things already about. And so it's a little bit ironic that we actually tend to be better listeners with strangers than we are with the people that we love, just because of how many more assumptions we make when we're talking to people that we love. The other dynamic that goes on that's particularly relevant to vaccine conversations is a process that I'll walk through. And Jane Anvik, in that video about the Alaska Humanities Forum, she talked about getting into silos, and that's this process that I'm about to describe. So in the United States, really around the world, but I know best our own country. Over the last 100 years or so, we have increased people's general mobility in terms of their ability to move from one community to the next, to pursue opportunities, to seek out communities that are like-minded. And as a result of that mobility, we see a phenomenon where we're sorting ourselves into communities that tend to be fairly like-minded. We see this with the dynamic where urban centers are becoming more and more liberal, progressive, and rural areas tend to be more and more conservative. And you also see this dynamic in a larger way with certain states and so forth. Because of this sorting, we are less and less likely to be in deep relationship with people who are really ideologically different from us. And there's this quote that I love: whoever is underrepresented in your life will be overrepresented in your imagination. And so these people that we are not seeing a lot in our lives because of this phenomenon of sorting, we start to imagine what they must believe and what they must be like based on a really limited set of inputs. And we're very aware of the people we're in community with and how, what a strong variety of viewpoints there are among us, and, all of this sort of stuff. But we tend to stereotype other people who are not in our community. And that's where we get into the othering, where we start to assume a lot of things about people who we're not in relationship with, who are in communities that are different from ours and who are ideologically different than us. And we start to see them in a very specific, limiting, stereotyping way. And so then the next step in the process, once we've othered people who are different from us, is we start siloing. And this is where we have very specific stories about these people, and we chain them together. So for instance, we have started to see a phenomenon where when we believe we know one thing about a person, we start to believe we know a lot of other things about them. If we know that somebody lives in rural Indiana, we start to think that we already know 10 other things about them because of where they live. If we know that somebody voted for Trump, we think that we know a lot of other things about them and their politics. If we know that somebody voted for Biden, we think that we know a lot of other things about them. And that's because of this chaining of identity. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not, but this is where we get into assumptions. And so because of these chaining of identities, when we get into conversation with other people, we often chain together a lot of stories about who they are and where they're coming from and what they believe based on a few limited inputs that we have about them. And we do this in particular with vaccine conversations. So, if we know that somebody has chosen not to get vaccinated, or if we know that somebody has chosen to get vaccinated, or if we know that somebody is against a national vaccine mandate, or if we know that somebody is for a vaccine mandates that happen in private businesses, we start to think we know other things about their beliefs, their practices, and so forth. And those assumptions affect how well we're able to listen to other people. It really shuts down our ability to hear things that go contrary to that assumption. And a lot of times we'll fill in the blank with our imagination. Assumptions are one of the barrier, and expectations are another one of the barriers to compassionate listening. It's a subtle distinction. So I think that there's a really interesting study that helps to illustrate this in my mind. And Yuri Hassan is a cognitive scientist, and he did a study with a short story that's called Pretty Mouth and Green My Eyes, which is a weird phrasing, but it's a J.D. Salinger story. And in that story, there is a man who calls his friend and is telling him about all of his fears about his wife cheating on him. And so he's telling his friend this. And in the short story, you know that there is an unnamed woman lying in bed next to the friend who's taken this phone call. They had in the study, they had one group listen to this story, and before they listened to it, they told them that the woman in the bed is the friend's girlfriend. So that girlfriend is in the bed, and he's listening to his friend talk about his wife possibly cheating on him. And then the other group was told that the woman in the bed is the friend's wife. And so the friend is calling him, worried that his wife is cheating, and right in the bed is that wife cheating with the best friend that is being called. It's the same story, but each of these groups got a different priming about what was going on. And their brains were scanned as they were listening to the story. And the differing detail entirely changed the subject's brain patterns in really predictable ways, so that once you knew what the brain scan of a person who thought that the friend was with his girlfriend, what that brain pattern looked like, you could recognize all of the people who were told that it was a girlfriend. And if you saw the brain pattern of someone who believed that it was the wife in the bed with the friend and that they were cheating together, you could tell just based on the brain scan that all of these particular people had been told that detail. And I bring this up because our background knowledge and our expectations lead us to measurable neurological differences in how we hear information. And that is something that is constantly affecting us. And we know that the background that we have, the experiences we have, are unique, and there is no one else who has those particular experiences and background, has that particular background knowledge necessarily. And so you're going to be hearing whatever the speaker is saying through that lens, and that is going to affect how you interpret and understand it. And that might be very different from the way the person speaking it is understanding what they're trying to communicate. It's also really relevant to vaccine conversations, because when we hear new information, we process it in two different ways, depending on whether it confirms our beliefs or it conflicts with our beliefs. And so when we hear new information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs, we ask ourselves, can I believe it? That's interesting. Can I believe it? And unless it's really, really unbelievable, we tend to just jump on board and assume that it's accurate and take it as a real piece of information that we're adding to our arsenal of information about this particular topic. When it conflicts with our beliefs, we approach it with a really different question, which is, must I believe it? We approach it with a deep skepticism. And so we have to be attuned to the way that our expectations about whether something is right because it's confirming our belief, or our expectation that it's likely wrong, how that affects our ability to hear and take it in. We may want to be much more skeptical with information that confirms our beliefs, and we may want to be much more generous in interpreting and considering information that conflicts with our beliefs. And you see this come up in vaccine conversations all the time. Most of us are not epidemiologists or virologists. Most of us are not doctors, or, and we're getting information all the time. And we're either kind of going like, yep, I can believe it, or must I believe that? That seems pretty hard to believe. I'm going to reject that until I see something really undeniable that proves that. And we're all doing that all the time when it comes to information about COVID. So the final barrier to compassionate listening is our goals. And our typical vaccine conversation goals are to persuade in some way. We typically come to vaccine conversations with a deep desire to get people on our side to agree with us, because oftentimes we believe that the stakes of people disagreeing on these things are very high. They have really high consequences on the day-to-day things that we can do in our lives. They have major consequences potentially on our health. They have major consequences on our relationships. And so we want to get people to agree with us. That's a typical vaccine conversation goal. But we know that people don't just see with their eyes, they see with their entire biographies. And when it comes to our deeply held beliefs, it has taken us our whole life to get to that deeply held belief. And it is unlikely that a single conversation is going to change our mind about something that we feel really strongly about. So if you come to a conversation with somebody who has very strong beliefs about vaccines, you are really unlikely to get anywhere with a goal of persuasion. It might be different if you're talking to somebody who's just kind of uncertain, on the fence, doesn't think about it much. But if you're talking to somebody who knows what they believe, trying to persuade them is a pretty futile endeavor. Now, we also come with a few other goals sometimes. We might actually want to shame someone for their perspective. We've given up on persuading them, but we really want to make them feel bad. We want to make them feel like they are a destructive member of our society, our family, our community in some way. And so sometimes that's our explicit conversational goal. And you can see that when people get really antagonistic. If you're trying to shame someone, you're probably not listening very closely to anything that they're saying. If you're trying to persuade someone, you're often not listening to what they're saying, except through the lens of trying to prove them wrong or score points against what they're saying, try to show that they don't know what they're talking about. That's the lens that you're looking through it with, and that is certainly not a compassionate form of listening. Excuse me. What might seem like it lends itself to compassionate listening is the conversational goal of commiserating. And when we are talking to people who are siloed in our ideological communities, a lot of times we come to a conversation assuming that we all agree about those awful people or this awful situation, and we're looking to commiserate with the other person. What is challenging about this for listening is it seems like it might be a goal that would lend itself to compassionate listening, but the reality is that you're looking so much for agreement about your feelings. You're looking so strongly for validation of your feelings that it doesn't leave much space for you to hear differing feelings and differing beliefs from the other person. And oftentimes, when it's really clear that you come with a goal of commiseration, people feel deeply uncomfortable sharing that they might disagree with you, that they don't actually aren't actually upset about those people over there. Maybe they even agree with them. But if you've come to them with an assumption, I mean, this gets back to the assumption piece, but it's also just this desire, this strong desire for the person to share in your emotional landscape. It can shut out the space for them to share their actual feelings and beliefs, and it prevents you from hearing them, even if they do. And then the last one is to show off. Sometimes you don't believe you can persuade them. You're not interested in shaming them, but you're there to show off all that you've learned and that you know, and how knowledgeable you are on a particular topic. And if you're there to show off, you are there to explain and to speak and to do all the talking, and you're probably not very concerned about listening to the other person. So these typical vaccine conversation goals get in the way of listening well. So if those are the barriers, how can we break those barriers down? What skills do we need to listen compassionately to someone else? So we had 5 barriers, so I'm going to give 5 techniques for compassionate listening. And the first is to shift your goals. And so we ended on goals with the barriers. And the first step is to rethink the intentions you have behind the conversation. And we have an entire webinar all about why we need to redefine our goals. And so if you want to go deeper on the goals of vaccine conversations, I recommend that webinar. But essentially, you can flip the typical script of a vaccine conversation by shifting your goals and making your goals something that the other person would sign on for. Most people would not sign on for a conversation where they're being persuaded to drop their most deeply held beliefs. They're not going to sign on for that. Most people are not going to sign on to a conversation where they are being shamed. And most people don't want to be talked at so that you can show off all your knowledge and, research and so forth. There may be some people who sign on for the commiseration, but it's really hard to tell when somebody is authentically signing onto that, because there's such a strong push to just go ahead and commiserate if you are in a relationship with somebody. And so it's really hard to know whether that's an authentically shared goal, or if the person is just kind of going along to get along. Some goals that are things that another person would sign on for, regardless of whether they agree or disagree with you, is a goal of deepening and prioritizing the relationship. And we'll talk about this more, but if your goal in the conversation is to get to know this other person's most deeply held belief and understand them better, most deeply held beliefs and understand them better, and use this topic as just like a means, a jumping off point of getting to know this person better, most people are thrilled to have the opportunity to be seen, heard, and listened to deeply. And so most people would absolutely sign on to that conversational goal. As part of that effort of prioritizing the relationship, your goal might be to learn the unspoken story behind their beliefs. If you are incredulous that a person could have a particular belief, or that they could be making particular choices, then that incredulity, that inability to understand where they're coming from, there's a lot there. You can get curious about it rather than turning away from it, rather than feeling repulsed by it. And so here's an opportunity to learn the unspoken story behind this person's beliefs and behind their choices. A lot of times there's just, like I said, we see with our entire biographies. And so their unspoken story is a story of their life, and there's a lot in there. And then another thing that is, a little bit more for people who are into intellectual exercises, but you might also just be curious to seek out the weaknesses in your own point of view. To strengthen your convictions, you have to very confidently confront rather than avoid the challenges of your best opponents, right? And so if you're coming to the conversation in an effort to find the weaknesses in your own point of view, a lot of times somebody who deeply disagrees with you would absolutely sign on to that conversational goal. So these are just 3 conversational goals that really shift your ability to listen to the other person. You can see how when these become your goal, the goal becomes an asset to listening rather than a barrier to listening. So then that speech thought differential, your processing speed that we talked about before, this idea that you process, you can talk at 125 words per minute, but you can process more than 400 words per minute. That can be space that you fill with distractions and get you off topic, but that can also be space that allows you to really deepen your engagement with the person who's speaking. And so how do you deepen your engagement through that extra processing space? So one thing to be focusing on is the other person's motivations and their motivations for telling you this particular thing. You can be asking yourself, why is this person sharing this with me? Why is this important to them right now to tell me? That helps you to stay on point with hearing what they say and getting to maybe some of the subtext, some of what's underneath the specific words. Another thing to be listening for that keeps you listening to what the person is saying and not getting veered off into your own thoughts is listening for unmet needs. What does the speaker need that they're not getting? Are they really looking for validation? Are they needing a space to grieve something that they've lost? Are they looking for, respect to be expressed? What are some of the unmet needs that are being subtly implied by the things that they're saying? And this allows you, again, to focus on what they're saying as you're using that extra processing power that you have in your brain. You can also be explicitly seeking out things that are unknown. Asking yourself, what am I missing here? Can allow you to focus on what they're saying in a deeper way. And then the last thing is, when we get confused, our brain's default is to just kind of dismiss information and to gloss over it and to throw it out. It's confusing, let's just throw it out and focus on what we understand. But if you use your brain's extra processing speed to just notice what's confusing, as opposed to allowing your brain to do its default throw it out the window mode, you can spark a lot of curiosity that you can use to dig deeper, to ask clarifying questions, especially if you're coming from this place of generosity, of assuming that your confusion is not because the person is incoherent, the other person is incoherent, or that they don't know what they're talking about. But if you have a generosity of spirit that like, there's maybe some miscommunication or maybe a misunderstanding, or you're missing something, the unknown, and that the confusion is worth exploring so that you can get to a space of understanding. Just making space to pay attention to where you're getting confused and dig into it rather than pulling away can be a nice use of that extra thinking space that you have. We also can notice and check our assumptions. So when we're talking about assumptions, assumptions are kind of like earplugs for us with listening. Our assumptions just shut us down, and we don't hear things that conflict with our assumptions. We don't notice things that we could get curious about because we fill in that unknown space with our assumption. And so we can think of our assumptions as a kind of earplug. So how do you unplug your ears from those assumptions? Well, you get curious, and you get curious by having those goals that are leaning into the relationship and the things that the other person would sign on to. And so you can, if you're in that space, then it's much easier to save some brain space for noticing your assumptions and then checking them with questions. And a really, really simple one is, tell me more about what you mean by blank. We use big idea words all the time without really clarifying what we mean. And what one person means by trust and what another person means by trust are often two very different things. And so if we can check our assumption about what a person means when they say trust, do they mean the same thing that I would mean if I said trust? Then that gives us an opportunity to really listen deeper. So that one phrase can be a really nice one for checking our assumptions. Another one is just asking, have you noticed that I'm making any assumptions that you want to challenge? That's a question that requires a little bit of trust in your authenticity in hearing the person's answer. But if you have the right relationship with somebody, you can just ask directly, what am I assuming that I should think differently about? Are there any ways you're thinking I'm misunderstanding your perspective? That gives somebody the opportunity to share some things. Well, I'm not sure you really understand this about where I'm coming from. Another technique that is really effective with listening is a technique called looping. And looping is used a lot in two fields, at least, I'm sure other ones as well, but one is journalism and another is therapy. And in this, what you're doing is you're going through a process of kind of making the process of listening more visible isn't quite the right word, audible to the outside person. So it's not just that you know you're listening, they know that you're listening, and it creates a virtuous cycle, essentially. And so the first thing that you do is you really try to listen to understand. And one thing, I mentioned the journalism example, is if you listen with the idea like, I'm going to listen as if I have to write an article about what this person is saying tomorrow, you have to listen a lot more closely than if you're just sort of following along, right? So first you listen to understand what the person is really saying. And then you offer that understanding as best you can. And you offer it to the person with the knowledge that it is very likely that you're going to get something wrong. And so sometimes we offer our understanding from a place of just trying to prove we get it, try to move forward. Yeah, I heard you. I get it. I'm going to show that I understand you. This isn't that. What this is this is offering your understanding, knowing that it's likely that you're wrong in a few places. And so if you are open and welcoming of the idea that there's probably some places that you're wrong, when you offer that understanding, you have a stance that allows you to really closely observe their response. And when you're observing their response, you can look at it and say, ooh, I think that I might have gotten something wrong there, because you can see in their body language, or they may even tell you like, not that. And then you work with them to polish your understanding before moving on. And this is a really, really powerful practice when you are in conflict with someone. And it can be hard because of all of those barriers, in particular our goals. A lot of times we get really stuck on coming back to that goal of persuasion. And if you still have somewhere in your heart a goal of changing the person's mind, it's going to be hard not to feel like, oh, but I need to start shifting into a mode of not just listening, but telling, right? So that I can persuade them. So we've got to keep that really, really firm goal of I am here to try to understand the other person's perspective. You can ask these questions of, is that right? Tell me more about this. Again, that just keeps on expanding out the piece that you're listening to. So rather than asking an entirely new question, pull out one detail from something they said and ask them to tell you more about that. It feels sometimes, if you go through this process, I certainly, when I've gone through this process, I've gotten nervous of like, oh, but there's so many interesting things. If I keep on asking down the same pathway, like maybe we'll get stuck and I won't go anywhere, I won't learn anything interesting. But going deeper is almost always way more interesting than staying on the surface and going really, really wide and casting a wide net in terms of where the other person is coming from. So the final one, which I guess I didn't highlight this time, but the final one is remembering something, it's just a basic stance, that neither listening nor empathizing is an endorsement. So one of the barriers that I would categorize under the assumptions is an assumption that if you listen to somebody, if you show that you empathize with them, that you are somehow indicating an endorsement of their perspective, which feels like a betrayal to yourself, to other people in your camp. And so that can make it hard to listen, because it feels like I can't listen without telling the person that they're wrong, that I disagree with them, all of these sorts of things. But if you can remind yourself that listening is not an endorsement, then it can give you the confidence in the space to actually maintain an open ear to what they're saying. And Dylan Marin has a TED Talk called Empathy is Not an Endorsement. And in it, he says, empathizing with someone you profoundly disagree with does not compromise your own deeply held beliefs and endorse theirs. It just means acknowledging the humanity of someone who was raised to think very differently. I think that we get into this mentality because there is a phrase that, silence is complicity. And I'm not challenging the idea that if you never speak up, that is being complicit with things that you might feel are deeply immoral. But what I am saying is that that there's a difference between silence in your life and silence in the moment that allows you to hear what somebody else has said. And so there is space to focus on listening without always feeling like if the person is saying you disagree with, that you must absolutely in that moment speak up right then. So then the last piece is listening to yourself critically. And this is just a piece where from the same book, but listening, you're not listening. Listening is not just something you should do while the other person is talking. It's something you should do while you are talking. And I bring this up because it's just really important for us when we're in these vaccine conversations to not default to just speaking without listening to ourselves. We need to be careful about hearing what we're actually saying and reflecting on whether it's what we mean as we say it. As we're listening to ourselves, we should think about the way that we are responding to information and how what we believe we accept so long as we can believe it. And what we don't believe or what conflicts with our beliefs, we are extremely skeptical to. And so if we can shift that frame and listen to ourselves and say, do I have to believe all the things? Like, what if I didn't believe these things? What would it take for me not to believe these things? Must I believe everything that I believe? What are the weaknesses of what I am saying? Do I really know the things that I am putting forth as facts are absolutely true? And to what extent have I accepted it willingly because it already conformed with my own beliefs? That's the ear that you're putting on when you're listening to yourself that will allow you to then be more open when the other person is talking. And that's because sometimes it's not just that other people don't understand us, it's that we don't understand ourselves. And so listening to ourselves can be a really key way of building self-awareness so that we can just be more open to every conversation. Here are some questions that you can ask yourself. What am I assuming? Where am I giving myself more grace than those who oppose me? Where do I feel conflicted? And where does my thinking defy expectations? How have I contributed to the vicious cycle of conflict? And what am I learning about myself from my reactions to people I disagree with? These are the lenses you can put on when you're listening to yourself, how you can use that extra thinking space when you're listening to yourself. So with that, we have 2 upcoming webinars next week, Navigating Difficult Conversations About Childcare and what we've learned about depolarizing vaccine conversations, which will just kind of go over what we've learned over the course of this whole series. And we'll move into our Q&A. I'll hand it off to Odd. Before I do that, I just want to say that we are wanting to really welcome people from every view and the spectrum of views around vaccines. And like I was mentioning with siloing and sorting, we often assume that we're in a room of people who all agree with us. And so what I would just say is, if everyone could be really careful to frame your questions in ways that are deeply respectful to beliefs that are different from yours, we would appreciate that.
Hey, thanks, Megan. So we do have a question right off the back from Sandy. And speaking of siloing, they understand what chaining is, but if you can clarify what siloing is a little bit further, they would be appreciative of that.
Yeah, I was just thinking that I didn't explain that very well. So, and I'm feeling like I need to kind of brush up on it. So othering is when we stereotype a person, and sorting is where we kind of group people. Siloing is where we become we get immersed in a single story, right? So it's the difference, like our story is very particular because of the people that we are surrounded by, and we keep on repeating the same stories. It's a way of, it's the phenomenon that happens when I'm not really satisfied with the way that I'm explaining this right now. So what I can say is that the best explanation of it that I've seen is in a book, I never thought of it that way, by Monica Guzman. That is the book that really goes into sorting, othering, siloing, and chaining in great detail. And it's a beautiful explanation.
Thank you, Megan. If anyone else has any questions, or Sandy, you want to unmute and follow up with that, if additional question. And it looks like Jenny said, this was wonderful, thank you. Really helpful for informing one-on-one conversations. Do you have ideas for how this curiosity approach could be deployed in mass communications or organizational communications?
Yeah, so in terms of mass media, I think that one of the things that I find a really interesting reframing is sometimes I think that journalists see their role as trying to like uncover things that are ways in which people are being misled, or like that they're trying to uncover nefarious practices by different people, whether those are politicians or businessmen or like your neighbor. They're covering the murder or the person who's embezzling money and things like that. And they're doing that with this idea that, it's important to ferret out those things so that you can remove those sources of distrust from your community. I also think that there's a role of journalism that is helping to weave community back together and to build trust among community members. And I wonder what this looks like in what conversations about vaccine in the media look like when they are trying to do that, when they are trying to ensure that people feel seen, heard, valued, and start to trust one another again. Another thing that I think about in both of those cases is we try really hard in this series to avoid binaries of like people who support vaccination, people who are against vaccination. There is a whole spectrum of beliefs on any issue, and it does not come down to a binary. And binaries tend to sow division very explicitly. So in organizational communications and in mass media, I think that one of the biggest things is framing everything that you talk about in a way that really honors the full spectrum of beliefs. There are people who are fully vaccinated, but really passionately against vaccine mandates. And there are people who are really passionately against national vaccine mandates who very strongly believe in the rights of individual organizations and businesses to mandate, private businesses to make a mandate for the people that go to their businesses or that work at their businesses. And there are people who believe that mandates have no place anywhere. And there are people who are who have all sorts of like there are people who really just want more time before they're interested in getting a vaccine. And there are other people who there's no timeline on which they'd ever be interested in a vaccine. And all sorts of beliefs in the world. And so I think that one of the other things here is just really honoring the full diversity and not getting caught up in this chaining of like the binaries and the chaining of like, if you believe this, you must also believe these other things. Does that answer the question?
Then you put in the chat, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks, everyone. I look forward to continuing to be in touch and seeing you at future forum programming.